Hi, everybody. So I promised visuals for this module, and so I'm going to just share a PowerPoint with you on the U.S. as a world power, the expansion of the U.S. as a world power. So we'll go through just some of these slides for you. So the Spanish-American War of 1898, your textbook talks about this a little bit, but again, I just want to make sure that you get the big picture about this. So this is the event that puts the United States on the world scene. It is the one big event where we talked about in that micro lecture the idea of the United States wanting to be on the world scene, worrying about competition from European powers who had all dominated the world through different empires. The United States wanted to be a part of that party. We wanted to be a part of that scene. So how do you achieve that when everybody else has already carved up the world? And an opportunity came about in Cuba, which we'll talk about in a second, but it comes to be known as the Spanish-American War. So this is the biggest point I want you to know. This is the event that puts the United States on the world scene. I've got a little quote there, the splendid little war, which I'll refer to in a little while. So the Spanish-American War really starts in Cuba. The Spanish had controlled all of Cuba for many years. They had a huge empire around the world, the Spanish did. But in Cuba, which you can see from this map, just as a reminder, is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So it's a very close neighbor to the United States. We'll be talking about Cuba on and off throughout the semester. The Cuban people wanted to throw off the Spanish. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to be free. And so there was uprisings. And the United States started to look at this. This was an opportunity perhaps to do something and to make a difference to the American position on the world scene. So the United States had invested a lot of money in Cuba, a lot of different businesses, different things like that. And so as you have this conflict that's growing in Cuba, the American newspapers and American media starts focusing in on this. The Spanish were pretty brutal in Cuba. They were very violent. There was a lot of starvation going on, different things like this. And the American newspapers had reporters down there who were picking up these stories, expanding on them, and really sensationalizing them. You've heard the term yellow journalism, I hope, and this idea of, I guess the phrase fake news is something similar today. But the yellow journalism of the late 19th century was competition between a couple of major newspapers, and they would sensationalize the stories that were being told. It wouldn't necessarily lie, but would certainly make them a bigger deal to get the American people fired up, to get the American people to buy their newspapers. This is one of those political cartoons that was used, the idea that the Spanish were searching women on American steamers, American ships that were going back and forth from Florida to Cuba, that they were, you can see strip searching, right? This is a naked woman being, searched by these evil Spanish men. You could tell they're Spanish by the beard, by the way, right? And so this kind of thing is going to outrage Americans and get them fired up about it. Other types of political cartoons, about Cuba being portrayed as this poor, innocent female, and the Spanish as wicked and evil and dangerous and probably sexually exploitive, damaging these women. And Uncle Sam is going to come in there and save the day and rescue poor Cuba. And Cuba is, of course, going to be loyal and thankful and all of those things. So this type of image of the United States as the noble heroes coming in and saving poor Spain and helping them out, or saving poor Cuba and the poor people of Cuba who so desperately need the Americans. And so this type of image is going to be played up both as the Cuban people are victims, the Spanish are evil, and the Americans need to be heroic coming in here. And this is going to be used to really fire up the American people. And again, the Spanish really don't treat the people very well, people of Cuba very well. Right? So one thing the Americans do, and the president at the time was William McKinley. He didn't really want to go to Cuba. He didn't want to fight in Cuba. He didn't wanted to stay out of that mess. But he did send the USS Maine down to Cuba, to Havana Harbor, to protect American interests, because there were a number of American interests down there. It was a big deal sending this ship down to just kind of hang out in the harbor, say, hey, look at us. We're here. We've got this big ship. Don't mess with American stuff. Don't mess with the American people, and don't mess with the American goods or businesses. And so this is seen as this kind of passive aggressive, let's go down there and see what we can do. And then the Maine explodes. And obviously you can see this is a very dramatic image of the Maine exploding. It's in Havana Harbor. It explodes. All sorts of these drawings, right? You don't have a lot of photographs. You do have photography in this time period, but it's expensive and awkward. So you have a lot of these lithographs, these fine paintings that are done to help inform the people about it. And you can see this is a very dramatically drawn image of the explosion, the bodies that are flying up through the air that you can see here. So this idea of, Americans getting upset because Americans are killed. 266 American sailors die when the Maine explodes. And this becomes very controversial. Some Americans, many Americans believe the Spanish did it. The Spanish had a mine in the harbor and blew up the American ship, and it was war. Some others thought that the Cubans had done it to try to make the Americans think that the Spanish had done it, so America would go to war against the Spanish. There's been some debate in the late 1990s. There was a study done by National Geographic that determined that there was an explosion, that the boiler had exploded from internally, and that's what had actually occurred, that it was just an accident. Now there's new controversy that, no, that probably wasn't it. It probably was a mine that the ship accidentally bumped into, and who knows. What really happens is that this is in February of 1898. The United States gets more and more worked up about this. The American newspapers get more and more fired up about this. They see more images. Again, this is a photograph of the Maine once it had been razed, right? They put, they went into Havana Harbor and razed the remnants of the Maine, and you can see how it was totally smashed to pieces. Obviously a major explosion. The American people are calling for this to be, someone has to pay for this, right? Someone has to pay for this. You can see these newspapers. The top one is from a San Francisco paper saying, the mutterings of war growing louder. This is not long after the explosion. Here's an image of the ship going to her doom. Is the government keeping back information? Statesmen are very curious. Is the president hiding something? Here's the New York Journal saying, Spanish treachery and the crisis is at hand. And these very big, very loud, what they call above the fold headlines. And above the fold, since most of you don't know newspapers very well, is, the newspaper is folded, right? And when it's in a box, or when the boy is selling the newspaper, anything above that fold on the front page, right, is going to be seen the most and is considered the most important. So these are all above the fold headlines here, where people are going to see this, going to hear this and feel this most of all. Okay. Again, lots of images in different magazines and different editorial cartoons to punish the Spanish. You can see here's a American ship has been drawn here, and this says retribution right in the hiney there of King Alfonso the 13th of Spain, and how we need to punish them as well. You know, more images of the United States and Cuba, and the Spanish being, you know, fighting in Spain, because what finally happens is, this image is from April 24th. What finally happens is on April 25th, 1898, President McKinley orders war against Spain, right? Asks Congress for a declaration of war against Spain to defend Cuba and help Cuba become independent. There'd been a lot of controversy. Again, President McKinley didn't want to do this. Theodore Roosevelt, who we know will become president very soon after, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, and he said that President McKinley was basically a wimp, that he had no more backbone than a chocolate eclair, right? The big, you know, stuffed donut, that he was just being a wimp, and we needed to go into Cuba and take Cuba. The importance of this is it's not just about Cuba, and it's not just a war with Cuba. And again, here's more images trying to convince Americans to be a part of it. And you know, we can't forget the Maine. We can't forget these poor, starving Cuban people. We have to do something. And we do. We declare war against Spain. The United States calls for volunteers, calls for 125,000 volunteers for the Army. They get 1.5 million volunteers, including groups of Black men who decide that this is a good way to prove their citizenship, prove that they are Americans, and have the opportunity to serve. Right. The United States fights in the Philippines. They fight in the Caribbean. Here's in the Philippines, where in February, the Maine had been sunk here in Havana Harbor. But the Americans are able to go in and defeat the Spanish fleet here. Here's the charge up San Juan Hill, right? And again, your textbook talks about this. But then the Spanish Empire is also in the Pacific and in the Philippine Islands. And so hopefully you know where the Philippines are. They're very important in American history, especially 20th century American history. But here's China. Here's French Indochina on this map. And French Indochina today is Vietnam, but it was controlled by the French in this time period. And so it's called French Indochina. Here's the Indies and things like that. But you can see all of these places are called other places, right? It's British North Borneo. It's French Indochina. It's the Netherlands East Indies, right? That worldwide empire is important. And the Philippines here are controlled by the Spanish. And the Americans send in Commodore Dewey. He'd been based in Hong Kong. Commodore Dewey takes his fleet in to Manila. And you can see, you know, the map here, and I'm not going to go into too many details. We'll see Bataan again when we talk about World War II, but goes in here in August of, in the spring and summer of 1898, and basically destroys the Spanish fleet. I love this image of it because it's got a little drawing of Commodore Dewey here in the bottom. And they go in, and these are the American ships, right? Very heroic. Again, one of these lithographs. And they go in and they blindside the Spanish fleet and completely wipe it out. So the Spanish lose everything. They lose their fleet in the Pacific, in the Philippines. They lose their fleet in Cuba. And they quit. Basically in Cuba, the Spanish soldiers are like, we're done. And in the Philippines, we're done. There's no reinforcements coming. We're not going to keep fighting. And so after 119 days, by the end of the summer of 1898, the war is over. And this is where this is where the Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, calls it a splendid little war, because it was 119 days. The Americans only lost 460 men in battle, and the United States gains an empire, because all of a sudden we've not just defeated the Spanish and helped liberate Cuba, but we've taken control of all of Spain's empire. So we have this huge shift all of a sudden. Just like that, we've got an empire. Now, I do want to point out that while 460 Americans were killed in battle, 5,200 died from disease. So out of those, millions of men who went to volunteer, and again, if you think of the volunteers, they have different motivations. These are the sons and grandsons of Civil War veterans. This is their war, their chance to prove that they are men. And then again, for those Black men, it's a chance to prove they're citizens and worthy of being treated as such. So this is a big deal that the United States has gained this, and you can see some of the publicity that comes out of it. The New York Journal and the New York World, which are the two major newspapers that really helped spur this conflict to begin with their yellow journalism. Again, above the fold, Commodore Dewey smashes Spanish fleet, surrenders, Dewey's fleet takes Manila, all of this. And you can see what a big deal this was and how this completely dominated the entire front pages of these newspapers. Right? Now, the reality is, and I think it's important to understand about the Philippines, is the Filipino people really were excited about the Americans coming in and kicking the Spanish out because they wanted to be independent. And the United States was really excited about the fact that the Philippines, and I'll go back to our map here, the Philippines is so close to Asia, right? It's so close to China. It's so close to Japan up the road here. It's so close to all of this. And that means trade. Remember, trade was a huge motivator in us wanting a world power. Now, all of a sudden, the United States has a base right there in Asia and can be a part of that trade in that part of the world. So while the Philippine people think that, okay, the United States, who says they are for everybody being independent, is coming in and helping us throw off the Spanish, because they'd been fighting for a long time to get rid of the Spanish as well. The United States doesn't want to leave. The United States says, no, we're actually going to stay, and we're actually going to keep fighting. So while the Spanish-American War is really 119 days, the United States ends up fighting in the Philippines for years, from 1898 to 1902. Something like 20,000 American troops are there fighting. By the end, by 1903, 1904, 4,300 Americans have died in the Philippines. 10,000 more Americans are dead from disease, and something like 50,000 Filipinos have died fighting against the United States, fighting against an empire taking them over. They just wanted to be independent. Now, the United States did it because they wanted that market. They claimed it was because the Philippine people weren't ready to be independent. They did go in and build roads, build schools, build hospitals. Those are all things that the United States did in the Philippines. And again, we'll talk about the Philippines more when we get to World War II, but the Philippines don't get their independence from the United States until 1946. So they were controlled completely as a colony, essentially, for 40 some years by the United States. Cuba as well does not really become independent. There's an amendment that the United States puts in place called the Platt Amendment, Platt, which your textbook talks about, where the United States will control their treaties and trade and all sorts of things. So Cuba didn't really gain independence either. The United States controlled them completely. And here's an examples of Filipinos United States brought back and set them up so people could see what they lived like and why we needed to be in the Philippines. Because this idea of why were we halfway across the world, on the other side of the world, and involved in this and having this territory. This was a big shift in American policy and quite controversial. So the best way to prove that we should do this is to bring some Filipinos over and show how primitive they are and how the United States needed to take care of them. It was very racist and very, very bad, very bad. Now, other places in the world that the United States decided to expand our empire, Hawaii was another location in this time period, this very short time period that the United States got involved. You had a group of American sugarcane farmers, but they weren't really farmers. They owned commercial plantations of sugarcane, white Americans that had gone to Hawaii. And they didn't like the Queen. They didn't like her ideas and her restrictions on them. And so they claimed they were being treated poorly. And the United States went in and basically took over and got rid of the Queen and forced the Philippines, or excuse me, forced Hawaii to become an American territory, quite unwillingly, obviously. And but there was no fighting back because we spent the last several years building up our Navy and our military so that we could go in and make them do whatever we wanted them to. So if you ever go to Hawaii, understand that you're in an occupied territory, even though it does become a state in the 1950s. It was taken quite forcibly in this late 1800s. Right? United States is now feeling good. This is one of the magazines of the time, the cover, that we are now world power. And you can see the ship on her head. This was, the popular image of women at the time, kind of the Gibson girl look. And you can see, she's firing the steam of expansion. And the growth of the American Navy was the biggest thing. And it had been something that had been done for several years, about a decade leading up to this ability to be a world power, and was very essential, but it was very forcible and definitely not always welcome. So by the end of 1898, just so you can see, this is our American empire, and it really is something for you to think about, that the United States, often we just look at, the United States and we just think of the continental United States, but you really do need to think of the empire. Cuba down here off of Florida, we're still influencing their politics and their economy and all those things. We gained Puerto Rico from Spain in 1898, so this has been a territory of the United States since then. We annexed, which means forcibly took, the Hawaiian Islands, the Midway Islands. We bought Alaska from Russia in the 1860s. Wake Island, again, annexed means forcibly took. Guam, we took from Spain. The Philippines, we took from Spain. American Samoa, again, we took. And the list goes on. So think about this as, the United States has this empire. We are more than the continental United States. And it really does put the United States on the world scene. We get involved in China here. Your book talks about the Boxer Rebellion. We get involved in, there's a conflict between Russia and Japan called the Russo-Japanese War, Russian and Japanese War. We get involved in that conflict, basically helping with the peace. But part of the way we do it is we send 16 of our brand new battleships later on to convince everybody that we're in charge. We're involved in Latin America quite a bit, and Mexico, and we'll talk about that in our next segment when we talk about the progressives, because it's really a little bit later that we're more involved in Latin America. But I just wanted you to have these ideas and see these materials about the growth of the American empire, because it really is a real shift in American attitudes and American behavior from this point forward, and more reflects the United States that we are today, with kind of this global reach that we just really had never had before. Okay, let me know if you have questions, and we'll see you on the flip side.